United States and China have one of the world's most important and complex bilateral relationships. Since 1949, the countries have experienced periods of both tension and cooperation over issues including trade, climate change, and Taiwan. Chinese Communist Party leader Mao Zedong establishes the People's Republic of China in Beijing on October 1st after peasant-backed communists defeat the nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang and thousands of his troops flee to Taiwan. The United States, which backed the nationalists against invading Japanese forces during World War II, supports Chiang's exiled Republic of China government in Taipei, setting the stage for several decades of limited U.S. relations with mainland China. The Soviet-backed North Korean People's Army invades South Korea on June 25th. The United Nations and the United States rushed to South Korea's defense. China, in support of the Communist North, retaliates when U.S., UN, and South Korean troops approach the Chinese border. As many as 4 million people die in the 3-year conflict until the United Nations, China, and North Korea sign an armistice agreement in 1953. President Dwight Eisenhower lifts the U.S. Navy blockade of Taiwan in 1953, leading Chiang Kai-shek to deploy thousands of troops to the Quemoy and Matsu Islands in the Taiwan Strait in August 1954. Mainland China's People's Liberation Army responds by shelling the islands. Washington signs a mutual defense treaty with Chiang's nationalists. In the spring of 1955, the United States threatens a nuclear attack on China. That April, China agrees to negotiate, claiming a limited victory after the nationalists' withdrawal from Dachin Island. Crises erupt again in 1956 and 1996. 9 years after the People's Republic of China asserts control over Tibet, a widespread uprising occurs in Lhasa. Thousands die in the ensuing crackdown by PRC forces, and the Dalai Lama flees to India. The United States joins the United Nations in condemning Beijing for human rights abuses in Tibet, while the Central Intelligence Agency helps arm the Tibetan resistance beginning in the late 1950s. China joins the nuclear club in October 1964 when it conducts its first test of an atomic bomb. The test comes amid U.S.-Sino tensions over the escalating conflict in Vietnam. By the time of the test, China has amassed troops along its border with Vietnam. Differences over security, ideology, and development models strain Sino-Soviet relations. China's radical industrialization policies, known as the Great Leap Forward, lead the Soviet Union to withdraw advisors in 1960. Disagreements culminate in border skirmishes in March 1969. Moscow replaces Washington as China's biggest threat, and the Sino-Soviet split contributes to Beijing's eventual rapprochement with the United States. In the first public sign of warming relations between Washington and Beijing, China's ping-pong team invites members of the U.S. team to China on April 6, 1971. Journalists accompanying the U.S. players are among the first Americans allowed to enter China since 1949. In July of 1971, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger makes a secret trip to China. Shortly thereafter, the United Nations recognizes the People's Republic of China, endowing it with the permanent Security Council seat that had been held by Chiang Kai-shek's Republic of China on Taiwan since 1945. President Richard Nixon spends 8 days in China in February 1972, during which he meets Chairman Mao and signs the Shanghai Communique with Premier Zhou Enlai. The communique sets the stage for improved U.S.-Sino relations by allowing China and the United States to discuss difficult issues, particularly Taiwan. However, normalization of relations between the two countries makes slow progress for much of the decade. U.S. President Jimmy Carter grants China full diplomatic recognition, while acknowledging mainland China's One China principle and severing normal ties with Taiwan. Chinese Vice Premier Deng Xiaoping, who leads China through major economic reforms, visits the United States shortly thereafter. However, in April, Congress approves the Taiwan Relations Act, allowing continued commercial and cultural relations between the United States and Taiwan. The act requires Washington to provide Taipei with defensive arms, but does not officially violate the United States' One China policy. The Ronald Reagan administration issues the 6 assurances to Taiwan, including pledges that it will honor the Taiwan Relations Act, it would not mediate between Taiwan and China, and it had no set date to terminate arms sales to Taiwan. The Reagan administration then signs in August 1982 a third joint communique with the People's Republic of China to normalize relations. It reaffirms the U.S. commitment to its One China policy. Though President Reagan voices support for stronger ties with Taiwan during his presidential campaign, his administration works to improve Beijing-Washington relations at the height of U.S. concerns over Soviet expansionism. Reagan visits China in April 1984, and in June, the U.S. government permits Beijing to make purchases of U.S. military equipment. In the spring of 1989, thousands of students hold demonstrations in Beijing's Tiananmen Square, demanding democratic reforms and an end to corruption. On June 3rd, the government sends in military troops to clear the square, leaving hundreds of protesters dead. In response, the U.S. government suspends military sales to Beijing and freezes relations. In September 1993, China releases Wei Jingsheng, a political prisoner since 1979. That year, President Bill Clinton launches a policy of constructive engagement with China. However, after Beijing loses its bid to host the 2000 Olympic Games, the Chinese government imprisons Wei again. 4 years later, Clinton secures the release of Wei and Tiananmen Square protester Wang Dan. Beijing deports both dissidents to the United States. The Nationalist Party's Lee Teng-hui wins Taiwan's first free presidential elections by a large margin in March 1996, despite Chinese missile tests meant to sway Taiwanese voters against voting for the pro-independence candidate. The elections come a year after China recalls its ambassador after President Clinton authorizes a visit by Lee, reversing a 15-year-old U.S. policy against granting visas to Taiwan's leaders. In 1996, Washington and Beijing agree to exchange officials again. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, accidentally bombs the Chinese embassy in Belgrade during its campaign against Serbian forces occupying Kosovo in May 1999, shaking U.S.-Sino relations. The United States and NATO offer apologies for the series of U.S. intelligence mistakes that led to the deadly bombing, but thousands of Chinese demonstrators protest throughout the country, attacking official U.S. property. President Clinton signs the U.S.-China Relations Act of 2000 in October, granting Beijing permanent normal trade relations with the United States and paving the way for China to join the World Trade Organization in 2001. Between 1980 and 2004, U.S.-China trade rises from $5 billion to $231 billion. In 2006, China surpasses Mexico as the United States' second biggest trade partner after Canada.